Well, first of all, I want to thank all those initial people, EMP, POP, for having me here today. I also want to thank Lutch Bratcher for walking into my store one day and saying, hey, I should do a talk on about creativity to this group. So I want to thank you for doing that. And I want to thank all of you for showing up this morning. Well, first of all, let's be clear about what I'm not. I'm not an expert on play. I'm not an expert on child development. I'm not a public speaker. So what am I here to talk to you all about play? Well, what I am is intensely, let me get this going here. What I am is intensely curious about the creative process and how new ideas form. So when I was asked to talk on the subject of play, I decided to think about what is a correlation between play and creativity? So what you're going to experience today is a little bit of my little deep dive and my experience into connecting those two things together. But what I have is over 30 years of experience in product development, leading product development teams with companies, leading brands such as Fisher-Price, Spin Master Toys, Leapfrog Educational Toys, Ohio Art, Aladdin, housewares, Stanley thermoses, and on down the pike. And so, as part of my process, in doing that, I was watching so many different product innovations, and in seeing how new ideas formed, I started to put my own theories together about what led to creative change. So this began a process for me of looking into various different areas where creativity is shown. The first place I went was looking into modern artists. The reason I chose artistic innovation as opposed to product or business innovation was because it's a relatively new concept. And while profit is in play, it's not the primary driver of innovation. So I began by looking into the life of Vincent van Gogh, because a lot has been written about him. Also, if you haven't been there, you have the opportunity at the Van Gogh Museum to see how his art developed over time. So from his very beginning work, you see the influences all the way to the point of his death. Also, of course, a lot has been written about him, both what he wrote in his letters as well as what others have written about him. This was followed up by a dive into Picasso and the formation of Cubism. And then on against a broader range of studies on the topic. One of the best books I read on this was by a gentleman, professor at Harvard, named Howard Gardner, who digs deeply into the idea of creativity and what forms that in a book called Creating Minds. I certainly recommend that if you're interested in this topic, that you take a look at that. So by doing all of this, I was able to see how some of my own ideas started to measure up against a broader range of topics on the subject. So then I went out to Europe and I did a hands-on creativity workshop. And in that creativity workshop, it became apparent to me that with all this so-called knowledge and all these so-called experiences if I had these ideas about creativity, that I needed to put them to test, that I needed to live them out in the real world. So I did what every middle-aged person does, is they quit their job and they decide to do something really foolish and crazy, and so I did. And what I opened was a store that's called the Aviary. Now, the idea behind the Aviary was to engage people in discussions about their creative process, to give them the tools that could inspire and enable that creativity to happen. So it includes things like notebooks. I have notebooks from Japan, notebooks from Germany, a lot of film cameras, pens, and other types of supplies that can help encourage that. Also, the idea behind the store that it would be small enough that I could engage people in conversations, that it would be sensory stimulating, that they would take them to a different time and a different place. Now, you have to understand, the store is 10 by 10. I want you to put that into perspective. So when you come into my store, you can be a wall walker, but it's not going to really last very long, where eventually you're going to have to talk to me. And so what I'm able to do in that is observe people about how they, what is going on in their lives, and what do they think about creative expression. And if you've been in my store, you certainly know that you did end up having to talk to me. Well, a key part of the selection in my offering is toys. Now, when I say a key part, I only have a couple of them, but they're kind of important. So the first one I have, though, is a product which I don't have out. It's called Bubber. I know it's Luce's favorite product, I know she put it on her list. And Bubber is like Play-Doh, except it never dries out. You can make things with it, but it's really fun to destroy because it's its amazing texture. because it's really interesting to play with. Another product, though, that recently came out is one called Kinetic Sand, and many of you may have actually seen the video on this. They put this video up on YouTube, and it had in the first week over 2 million hits, and so I'm going to share this video with you now. So that's Kinetic Sand, and actually the video doesn't do it justice. You have to come out and play with it and find out. So this product is 98% sand and it's 100% magical, and that takes people to a really interesting place. I guess hear a lot of you smiling and chuckling when it was happening. But when I will tell you, sitting in the store and watching people, when children come up to this product, they basically dig in and they say, "Oh, cool! Like, isn't that fun?" But adults, you can kind of have a different reaction. Adults tend to approach this, and I'll give you a kind of typical example. A gentleman walked in the store, and he's looked at that, and he goes, "What is it?" And I said, "It's sand." He goes, "Well, what does it do?" I go, "Well, it doesn't really do anything. It's just for fun." "You mean you just play with it?" And I go, "Yeah, you just kind of play with it." He goes, "I don't really get it." And it struck me at that moment that the way that children approach play and the way that adults approach play is very different. Children tend to just dig in with both hands. Adults tend to think about purpose and structure and need and what's behind that. They often also will always try to liken it to something that they've had in their life. It reminds me of, and so they go to this very different place. So it struck me again as I was preparing for this talk of, I wonder how that really relates to that difference between the child in us and the adult in us. Well, why don't we turn to what the experts and what they have to say about play. Allison Gopnik, who is a professor at the University of California in Berkeley, sees play as essential not just to individual development, but to humanity's ability to imagine and inhabit, change their environment. Pretty impactful. Further, she goes on to talk about why play is so important. So she and her fellow researchers say that this is a place where children are managing what she calls counterfactuals. Now, counterfactuals are what she calls the would've, could've, and should'ves of life. The place that children go where everything is possible and they imagine crazy outcomes. So pretend play takes children to a completely different world. And someone mentioned to me that they were embarrassed to say their favorite toy was Barbie when they were a child. And I don't know that's such a terrible thing, if you're a 5-year-old girl to imagining a world, around being Barbie, because that's where they're playing out all sorts of different ideas. And they take them to a completely different world where new rules apply, rules that they create in their own imagination. And we'll talk about rules. Because free play, in spite of it, as adults looking at it, it has an incredible amount of innate structure. So as an example of that, when children start to have a tea party, and one of the tea party attendees is a monster that's from the moon, and during that tea party, that monster tends to spill his or her drink, someone still has to clean it up. The children are actually creating a certain amount of structure in their world, even though we may look at it and think it's completely free. But there starts to be a change in children at the age of 4 or 5, and that play that was so free and unencumbered becomes a little bit more about how they're going to assimilate in society. And so you tend to see children at that age, their games tend to involve a lot of rules. They develop rules, and they spend more time in their playtime negotiating rules and arguing about what is fair and what is not fair. So there's definitely an elevation or an escalation in their play again, is they're trying to figure out play being a way to how do I fit into the rest of society. And so when that little girl is playing with that little Barbie doll, she's actually just pretending what it's like to fit herself into a much bigger environment. Well, my observation, and again, these are my thoughts, not coming from any scientific background, I want to be clear, that this process continues as we become adults. Adults in particular tend to look at constraints. The problem solving becomes a way that we apply our past knowledge to new problems. So we spend more time trying to be efficient. We spend less time being imaginative because it leads down to a lot of wrong paths, and at the end of the day, the job we're doing has to get done. So the reason I carry Bubber and kinetic sand is to remind us that we have that child side in each one of us. So even though play as we understand it is primarily a child's activity, it seems that adults have a need to try to control it, to try to define it, to try to establish its purpose. And free play as a child would experience it, has little place in this adult-centric world. So 30 years ago, there was a professor at the University of Colorado who was doing research into what infants are able to see. And as part of that research, he was doing work around the idea of how children can predict different outcomes. And so he created these computer animations, and it would basically be things like, children going through a tunnel, or a train going through a tunnel and coming out the other side. What he found in doing this is that children found it to be extremely entertaining. So he came to me. I was a product manager at a company called Aviary Baby Products at the time, and he wanted to develop a product that was around this very concept. And so the idea behind it was that babies could have a nice time, entertaining time, just having fun with these images, that they could be preoccupied with this. Now, our challenge, of course, was at the time there's nothing like this on the market, so how do you position a product that was like that? It was really about fun, it was really about play, but at the same time, we were putting a child in front of a television, and no one had done that before. So, of course, we all knew that children were going in front of televisions, but they weren't doing it with an intention of doing so. So we thought about how we were going to position it. Dr. Haiths, which you'll see here in just a second, was really clear about what he didn't want this to do, that he didn't want the positioning to be around something educational, that he really wanted it to be around fun. So we created this, and I got some words in there like enhancement, whatever the heck that means, like your enhances your baby. I don't know what it meant, but I got away with putting that in. But for the most part, it was really around, hey, this is a lot of fun. And so let's turn to what Dr. Haiths had to say about why he created the video.
I'm worried about where we stand in suggesting this video for your baby. Too often, parents are led to believe that they must do special things or buy special products to make their babies develop faster and better. I suggest that you relax, enjoy your baby, give your baby a lot of love, and your baby should turn out just fine. Basically, we developed this video because babies really liked what we had to show them. Auditory and visual capacities will develop normally. This video will provide your baby with a different experience and a new opportunity to practice those skills that they enjoy using so much. We really hope that your baby enjoys the sights and sounds that follow.
So you can see, as a product manager over that, I was having a bit of a challenge of it. I take that message into something that's really going to be compelling. Like, hey, you don't really need this, but if you want to, it might be a good thing for you. Well, so we did. We came up with this, and we did, okay with this positioning around that this is a product that's fun. However, later imitators and followers came out with a really strong educational benefit, and they created an industry. So it struck me at that point that adults ruled when it comes to defining the value of play and what the role of play is. So with that as a background, I turn to the idea of, well, how does all of this relate to the creative process? Well, it seems to me that there's a lot of similarities between the imaginative, free play side of our creative process, and then also on the other hand, the need for structure, process, and control. So how many designers do we have in the audience today? A lot of you designers. How many people are product managers or process managers that are in the room? Okay, not too many. And what do the rest of you just kind of like watch the battle that goes on between them? Because what happens is that there's this tension between those two very dynamics of freedom and play and uncontrolled variables to one of structure and process. So let's talk about how that ties in with designers. So designers really want to have, and again, you'll nod your heads, unstructured, unencumbered time to explore different possibilities. They want to think about the would've, could'ves, and should'ves of life. They want to imagine beyond what is probable into what is possible. In other words, they want to play. So when you think about Einstein, you may be familiar with his use of thought experiments. And thought experiments for him was a way for him to play with ideas that he couldn't test out in a lab. So he imagined what it would be like to travel at the speed of light. What would that feel like? What would the reality of that be? And that led to the development of the theory of relativity. So why then, in organizations, do we find so much resistance to such an open and free, unencumbered play? Well, part of it is that in organization, management, and by their extension, the project managers and the product managers, they're responsible to make sure that the objectives are met. They establish the goals, they manage the process toward those accomplishments. Structure takes the form of product briefs, milestone meetings, feature requirements, and they provide the constraints that ensure the efficiencies. In short, the management provides the purpose. So in our metaphor, the designers are the child side of us, and the management, or the project managers, are the adult side in us. And in between them lies the tension. So what is that state of tension in either your own personal life or that in your organizations? Well, I spent the early part of my career coming up with a lot of unique solutions. I invented the idea of putting a vibration unit on a baby bouncer, which revolutionized the category, and that technology was applied over to dozens of other products, which, for better or for worse, and over the last 20 years, have vibrated the heck out of tens of millions of babies around the world. I don't want to hear from the product liability people about that. As a product manager for the first wireless bicycle computer, I envisioned that that bicycle racers would be using a bicycle computer during the race to manage their feedback. I presented that idea to the United States cycling team at the time, and they said to me that would never happen, that maybe it would be used for practice and training, but it would never be used in races. And yet today, apart from EPO, probably one of the most used devices to help professional cyclists. So, I imagined a lot of things. But as I progressed in my career, I became really proficient at managing the process for creatives. I did it by establishing product development, a new product development process, by putting in boundaries, by putting in constraints. And by doing so, the teams became more productive. And as they became more productive, I got promoted. And as I got promoted, then I would get recruited. And I became an adult. Yay me. So, but then, as always in life, you're going to have some surprises. And when I was a senior vice president at Fisher-Price, part of my job was running the baby gear division. And we had a very talented group of designers. And we also had an equally talented group of project managers and product managers. Well, one year, a product manager had two very distinct product briefs. One was to create a baby swing, and the other one was to create a high chair. One of the designers, though, came to my office one day and with a rough prototype of something he'd been playing with. And it was a swing that transformed into a high chair. Now, that wasn't on the product brief. It wasn't in the product plan. The idea had merit, but it had some technical challenge. The team took it on, created a product, and the result was what we called the Swing and Meals high chair. And it turned out to be the top-selling product in the category, and one of the best sellers that we had in our product line that year. And it struck me at that time that maybe good ideas don't always come from a product brief, that sometimes good ideas, great ideas, come from a vivid imagination and giving people the opportunity to play. Because what we as managers often forget is that when creatives are involved in the ideation process, they will create their own constraints, just as we saw in the imaginary Tea Party example. When I was at Fisher-Price, also, we had a preschool property called Little People, and it was being challenged by really strong character brands. This is, again, 10 or 12 years ago. Brands like Sesame Street, Teletubbies. And I was given the objective to create a television pilot show that would bring the Little People to life. So we had to create a three-dimensional world for the Little People to live in. We were free to do whatever we wanted, as long as we incorporated the play sets into the activities, and that we were true to the basic characters' personalities. So from that, we had to create personality archetypes. And we had to develop some rules around what would happen in the world of little people. So for example, could animals talk? Could cars fly? And what roles did adults play in the world that we created? So in this clip that I'm going to show you coming up here, the little people, the backstory of this, little people are cruising around, and this is really a story about Maggie. Maggie is the more, I'm going to say aggressive and of the little people. She has a very distinct opinion about everything, and she makes sure that opinion is really well known. Anyway, so she's with her friends, and they come across a car that happens to be caught in a tree. Now, how that car got in the tree isn't really exactly clear, and it doesn't seem to faze the little people, but they have a job to do, and they need to figure out how they're going to get that out.
Listen to our idea, Maggie. I made a pair of wings.
And I can climb up and put them on.
Well, I show the little car where to fly. And I can put out a pillow for a soft landing. Gee, those are great ideas. What do you think, little car?
And here are the adults, by the way.
We're ready. This way, little car. Okay, ready, set,
I know, this will work.
go! Hooray! Yeah.
Well done, little car. And well done, Maggie. Listening to other people's ideas is a great way to solve a problem.
So even in our world where we had ultimate freedom and there were no adults in the room, we still created our own constraints. In this case, the car could not fly, but it could glide from the assistance of the little people. And adults, they were there to provide comic relief. The Christian apostle Paul once said, "When I was young, I thought like a child, I talked like a child. But as a man, I put aside childish things." But perhaps it's wrong to think about the link between the child in us and the adult in us is about growing up. Any more than it is to say that imaginative and free-form idea generation is any less or any more evolved or beneficial than the more structured process. Perhaps it's more about a paradox, where both need room to coexist, and we are meant to live in the middle of that tension, and the result is creativity. So in closing, I was on an airplane a few months ago, and my seatmate worked for a company that was doing water playground equipment. Yeah, I'm one of those people, you want to make sure you have your headphones when you sit on an airplane seat next to me. Anyway, we got talking about their new product development process, and it sounded familiar. Product managers talk to the sales department, they create the product brief, and it spells out the product requirements to the designers. So I asked about the designers, and he said, well, they're some of the best in the industry. They have over 20 years experience. And how many new products do you develop a year? He said, well, 4 or 5, and there's 2 or 3 different items within each of those themes. And I asked, how many of those are successful? I mean, how many meet the objectives that you actually set out for them? And he thought, and he said, oh, maybe 20%. So my response was, perhaps it's time to let the children play. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Before we get into our Q&A mode, we're going to spend a couple minutes just sort of talking amongst yourselves. The idea here right now is I'd like for you to think of an example in your work, in your career, your profession, where you find yourself using play sort of effectively to do something. And just talk with the people sort of around you. We'll spend about 5 minutes doing that. Introduce yourself and get to know people around you. And then in about 5 minutes, we'll come back and do some Q&A. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes we can spend on Q&A. If anybody has questions for Ken, we'll open it up at this point. Thanks.
Yeah, in the back.
So my question is kind of about risk-taking, because I know that as adults, our level of risk-taking drops a whole lot. And as a creative, proposing a really creative solution is met with a lot of adversity because of that risk and the structure of the adult side of us. So what kind of situations did you come up against that, and how do you maybe reconcile those two opposing opinions?
Yeah, well, so the question was really, I'm repeating the question so they can hear it for the tape. The question was really around the risk that's associated with taking a creative step out, with the need to control that risk and to have I guess I would say a more specific deliverable. There's a high association with risky behavior. It's funny. First of all, I want to say that everything that I go through is a process, and so the answer I give you today was probably different if there's people that work for me in the room. At some point they say, well, you wouldn't have said that 2 years ago. So it's always a moment in time in the answer. But I kind of that last analogy that I was giving, where someone was like, hey, if you're getting a 20% success rate with your current approach, isn't it time to take some higher risks? Because what do you really have to lose? I mean, you're only getting a 20% success rate anyway. And so I think it's a lot different if you have a 100% success rate or 80% or whatever that number is, and you're doing quite well with the current relatively non-risk behavior. I think it's really, really hard to push people to do that. But most of us are not in those numbers, and I think therefore it's not as hard to take that risk because you really don't have that much to lose. So I usually recommend that people take a certain part of that budget that they have and put it towards those high-risk projects. Or you can go to part of your time. It doesn't have to be money. It could be associating a certain amount of your time to be spending on high-risk projects that may not go anywhere. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about research into the creative process of Picasso and Van Gogh.
Yeah.
Is that synthesized, available anywhere? Selfishly, I would like to benefit from that research.
Maybe I should, huh? Well, no, the Van Gogh one, probably had to spend more time on Van Gogh than I did really on anything. And I will tell you that there's so many great books written on Van Gogh. First of all, the best place to go is reading his letters, because he wrote to Theo, his brother, almost every day. I mean, that's how they corresponded. So you get to see the things that were happening. And if you put on that lens towards his work, towards things like I did, towards motivation, one of the things that I'm quite fascinated about the creative process is motivation. What is it that can help? What is it that causes someone to overcome an obstacle? And when you think about Van Gogh in particular, and you think about the obstacles he faced, first of all, he had no ability to draw perspective. He didn't know. He couldn't do it. He would always screw it up, and so he ended up getting one of those perspective tools, right? So he could figure out how to start drawing perspective, and so he taught himself how to do that. And there was so digging in, you see those kinds of things. He put on that filter of his work, not just saying, hey, I want to understand everything about the man, but I want to understand everything about this process with a filter. It's a lot easier to do so. And with him, I'd start with his letters. Picasso is a little bit more interesting because it was, he had a biographer that's written 5 or 6 chapters on his life. So that's a little bit easier to get a hold of. But I'd start with that book, Creating Minds. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read on the subject. In Creating Minds, Howard Gardner looks at artists, a bunch of people from across disciplines, including Gandhi, Einstein, Picasso, Martha Graham, so across the different mediums, and he looks for commonalities and similarities. And if you're looking for something that's more concise on that, I'd start there. Yeah, Liz in the back.
Can you repeat the book name and the author one more time?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat the book name and the author one more time?
Yes. The book is called Creating Minds, and the author is Howard Gardner. Yeah.
Did you do any studies on Da Vinci?
No, I haven't. And it's funny because I looked into Da Vinci, but there wasn't that much written about. He didn't keep a journal of what he did, and that becomes a challenge for people who are trying to put together his life. If you're trying to see a sequence of someone over time, because we all are a product over time, and we look at snapshots, and journals are a great way to see that. And from what I could see on Da Vinci, maybe someone will correct me, but I wasn't able to find anything on that.
His drawings.
Yeah, just his drawings, his evolution of his drawings. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the dynamics between creative people creative people.
Structured people.
In the workplace. And it's very clear, you know, when you have creatives, you know, graphic designers and writers and all the rest, but you also have creative thinkers in an organization, and they often stick out like a sore thumb. So what advice do you have for helping to kind of create some more synergy between different styles of thinking and creative and problem solving?
Yeah, so the question was really around, like, in an organization where you have a group of creative thinkers, creative types, how do you integrate them with maybe the more structured people so you can address this tension? Well, I think part of it, and part of what I was trying to accomplish today, is getting insights into that other perspective, that it's not about right or wrong. It's not about the creative approach, free idea generation is the only way to go, and that the structure, you know, or the structured way and the process way is the way to go. I think that's, if that learning can happen, that there's value in each of these two very important processes. I know I cited in my conversation really around the topic of pushing for creative expression, because I think in most organizations we struggle with the opposite, that the adults are ruling. And I think it's time to let the creatives have a little bit more say in most of our organizations. And so at this moment in time, you know, I'm pushing more toward that. But I think the most important thing is to have a good dialogue, a good understanding between these two, that both are really, really important. That if you don't have constraints, you can go to wrong paths. And if at the same time, if you try to narrow it down, like a lot of product manager, their idea of giving a product brief is saying, okay, you can change the radius, but that's about, but you know, don't think about, you know, doing anything more than that, because I've thought this through and I think I know what the market needs. I'm not sure that we're getting the potential of the creatives if we do it that way. Yeah, in the center in the back.
Yeah, sort of in line with that question, it seems like more structured thinkers in the company are able to present numbers for why they bring value. Have you seen or used techniques to show the value of the creative process?
So the question was that the adults, a la the managers, are pretty good at presenting the numbers. And is there a way, have I seen a way that the more creative types can present that same kind of opportunity in a similar fashion to get their point across? That's basically, as I understood the question. I don't know. You know, it's funny. I was just thinking about this as I was running this morning. There's some people are involved with design think. You know, this idea of, you know, which is basically the creative. You know, I'm paraphrasing in my world. The creative people kind of try to take over that part of that process. And part of what they think about and what the point behind design think is move more of the creative, you know, opportunity to the front end of the process. Move more time, allow more time on the front end where the ideas can have a chance to, before they're too structured, before you've decided all the parameters. And so that's basically the essence. And I think that that's a really good idea, because I think people understand it's kind of mirroring those two worlds of, hey, we know there needs to be a process. We get it, but we want more time on the front end. We're not going to extend the time. You know, we're going to still work with whatever, if it's a nine-month window or whatever your window is. We're still going to work within those 9 months, but we're going to spend more time on the front end being creative. I think working, so I guess in paraphrasing, I think it's like working within the system, i.e. structure, to be able to present, you know, that opportunity is really, you know, it's really a strong one. But I would also say that there are a lot of creatives have that ability to make a compelling argument for an idea. So I don't know that we should just, you know, be overly, you know, concerned about like driving the numbers. I think sometimes we make decisions with our heart. And I'll tell you, if there's one thing I've seen in retail, it's that people do not make decisions with their brain; they make it with their heart. And I believe that's probably true in, you know, in our own organizations as well. It's just easier to argue the numbers. Yeah, follow-up question.
Isn't Apple and Google, aren't Apple and Google good examples of how the new platform of how to allow creativity along with structure, and that they're kind of the evolution of the old corporation?
Well, you know, I'm not familiar enough with, you know, the inside of either of those organizations to answer that question. Perhaps some of you are, but from what I've seen about Google, they're setting apart, you know, time for creatives to, you know, do their own creative work. I think is moving itself in the right direction. You know, Apple, you know, I don't really know what goes on with Apple today, and so I can't really speak to that either. Other questions? Yes.
I worked with a creative director for a long time who subscribed to the idea that, okay, let's present one idea that we feel, is exactly what the client told us they wanted, and then let's present, another idea that's a step removed, a little more of a risk, and a third idea that's, the biggest risk, so that you always sort of have that safe thing for them to fall back on. And I just wanted to know, is that something that you subscribe to, or, would you kind of shoot that method down? I'm just interested to hear your...
So the question was, lots of times when we're presenting something from a creative opportunity, we might pitch what was asked for, and then something that might push the envelope a little bit, and would I agree with that type of approach? Yes, I've used that approach, and it usually comes down to, we know they're going to reject this one, so then they would end up in the middle, right? This one, we could push them a little bit, from their original position, but maybe they'll recognize this one's too extreme, so we'll push them a little bit. Yeah, I don't know that really, I think it would be better to come in with a stronger position of why you really believe that this is important, and figuring out the way to talk to them, and that pushes that envelope, because I think in the middle we design camels that way, that whole idea that we're really not pushing it, we're not really going with the idea that we really believe in. I think it's better within our own, if that process, though, is happening within our own creative organizations, and we agree on how we're going to present the most compelling thing, that the battle is not with our client, but the battle is internally. We work those things through, and then we pitch the best idea that there is. That said, there always is that give them what they asked for, then give them something more. And I can understand the merit of that, but I would probably tend more towards let's come up with a really powerful positioning, and then if we have to go back, we'll go back. It's too easy to let them out. Yeah.
I feel like when you give them what they ask for, then you're in a relationship where they're treating you more as a production. Just produce this.
Yeah, exactly.
And it takes away your value.
Yeah, and is that why they pay what they pay you to be creative? Yeah, that's a big dilemma, I think, and that's the big challenge that we have with, especially when we're, on that relationship with a client, because at the end of the day, it's their work, right? And yet at the end, but they're hiring us for our expertise, and I think we owe them that opinion of it, and that's why I would tend to approach it with, you're always going to have a chance to go back. It's not like you're going to get kicked out, especially if it's an ongoing relationship. It's like, here's why we really believe this is a great idea. Here's the research that we have, or the information we have that supports this idea. It's just not because I feel this is a good idea, but here's the reason why we did this and why we think this is on strategy for you. And to that point, I think one of the most compelling things that you can do when you're a creative, and I've mentioned this to almost anyone that works with me on the creative side, is that that there's this tendency to think that your creativity in there is going to come through. And I think what you end up having to recognize is that creativity is not necessarily going to be recognized by them. It's something that you really need to believe in, that you really need to present, with conviction, because that's what they are paying you for. So I think it's really easy to go back and give them what they asked for, but I think it's a lot harder to give them what they need. But make sure that you tell them how it's on strategy. And that's where I was supposed to be going with that thought. Like, if you speak to them about strategy as opposed to execution, why is this on strategy? Like, why does this execution, even though it's pushing it, why does it still meet your strategy? If you can talk to them that way, it's a lot different than when we just like it. We think it's compelling. Yeah.
You mentioned that businesses should be giving their creatives more influence over product design and things like that. Is there a point where there's too much creative power, where it actually becomes detrimental to the project?
Sure. Right? I mean, we've all been part of that, and that's usually when the project has gone completely in a wrong direction. It's probably when you don't have the objective clearly established, so what are you really trying to accomplish? And if you keep coming, that's why I say, if you keep coming back to that point of, this is on strategy, is this meeting what we've said we were going to accomplish, it brings those things back in. Because when an idea comes out, you say, well, this doesn't meet the objective. So let me go back to that example I gave you about the swing high chair idea. So what was my process when that was presented? Well, we wanted to do a swing, and we wanted to do a high chair. And then when I thought about it, I'm like, okay, yeah, my process was, two-in-one products in this industry don't really work. You usually get not such a great swing and not such a great high chair, and nobody buys it. That's usually the problem. So if that problem could be addressed in the execution, where it was really a great swing and it was really a great high chair, or what we ended up doing was, it's a great swing and the high chair's kind of free, which is the way it worked out. You didn't really pay that much more for the height. It was like, how could you say no to that? How could the customer say no to that? How could the consumer say no to that? So in that particular process, it was like I was thinking through all of those things and going, you know what, let's go with that idea, even though it's not necessarily the idea that was put onto a product brief, because it made sense. People used a swing till the child was 6 months old, and then they no longer used it, and they had all that cost in the infrastructure of that, the structure of that swing. And high chairs can be used, from 6 months on, so it was a totally great idea. It made sense, right? But again, that was a situation where it was still within certain constraints. It wasn't so far out there that, hey, why don't we do a swing that can, like be a car seat? Okay, whatever, right? I think we have time for a couple more questions. Okay, in the back, yeah, Jen?
I had a question about inspiration. So you were talking about the moment where the dad was looking at the sand, kinetic sand, and he's like, I don't get it. I see sometimes where there's an opportunity to push the envelope and be more creative, and as a product manager, I might be asking for that, but knowing that extra work for the sake of the creativity may not always pay off.
Yeah.
So just trying to get at that moment where there's this mind switch between I don't get it, but I want to do it, or I become curious again.
So what's your question?
Do you get advice on that, or thoughts on how to push that?
So is a question around like how do you push that point where they become more imaginative and they don't just.
Yeah, where we shed kind of our cynicism or our structure.
How do you get the most efficiency out of creativity? So as a manager, how can you get the creative to create the most awesome creative thing without wasting too much time?
Okay, so the question was really like, how do I manipulate the creatives to give me what I really want, right? Okay, I know I'm joshing, but I'm not totally kidding, because I think there's something a little bit flawed in that thinking, where like, okay, because you know what? Because there's an assumption that if I don't do something to them, that they will go completely off track. That's what we feel as managers, and I'm saying we. That's what I felt as a manager too. Is that and because I felt like they would just go off track. I don't know that it's so bad that they go off track. And I think it really comes into looking and really being open to listening. Why did you go that way? What were you thinking? It may not be that execution, but in that idea, there may be something that you can work with. Like when on the swing high chair example, believe me, that execution that he first brought, it was bad. It was bad. And what literally happened was I said, okay, Paul, you got 2 weeks to be able to work this thing out, because we cannot waste any more of the time than 2 weeks. And the guy worked day and night because he wanted to see this idea come to fruition. And that's where I go with that. The difference, I think, in getting the most out of a creative is having them have the ownership in the idea. And you're not going to have them have ownership in the idea if you have given them every constraint in that they feel that they're just executing that idea as opposed to creating that idea. So I think it's really, really important to believe that what they're contributing, what a creative is contributing matters. And if they sense that you don't believe it matters and you're just placating them, it's not going to go anywhere. They're like, okay, fine, you just want me to execute. You're just going to have me go back. You're just playing with me. You got to really believe that what they're doing matters. Yeah. So.
Do you believe that constraint can be a prompt for creativity? Like with that chair, that person who designed the 2-in-1 added an extra constraint for himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, can constraints actually, encourage creativity? Absolutely. Absolutely they do. And I think that every constraint, like, again, if you even go back to my store, which was creating this, my constraint was I was in a 10 by 10. You didn't see it. It's 10 by 10. Like, I had to get a lot of product in 10 by 10 and make people be able to shop it and all that. That constraint blew out the ideas. We did things that no one had ever done from a merchandising point of view because we had a constraint of our space. I absolutely believe in constraints. My point was that this is a tension we need to live with, a certain amount of constraints and a certain amount of freedom, and that we tend to go towards, let's put more and more constraints on, or let's go to the other extreme of let's not have any constraints. And the real need is to live right in the middle of all that. And that kind of goes back to that question with how do you deal with creatives? Give them a certain amount of constraints, but give them a lot of freedom. And you got to live in that tension. So I'm not advocating either side. I hope that didn't come across. It really is like living in that middle.
Going back to the previous question, what experiences did you have with initiating
the creative team in a way that they understood the problem that you were trying to solve. And one of the challenges of letting them sort of go out and do their thing is that you want to make sure that what they're coming back with is truly addressing what the need is. But from a management perspective, I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that's always, I think, on my mind is if I just tell them to go off and do something and then they come back and it hasn't somehow solved the problem for the client, then everybody ends up feeling frustrated in the process.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to what are we really trying to accomplish? And I think also if we can talk with creatives as a co-creative person and not, take off that hat that, I'm here to be the official decider of what's a good idea and not then come to me with your idea. And we can be part of that. Like, again, it's being curious with them, right? Like, why did you like that idea? Okay, well, what if we did this with us? Because it's like digging into, they may come back, they may have gone off track, but I think you need to know why they are going off track. What did they see that was so cool that they wanted to go off track? How do they think that met the objective? So someone's like, well, tell me, how did you think that ties with what we were trying to accomplish? And yeah, sometimes the challenges are not so good at articulating that, but I think we need to get that back out of them and just keep being curious. Big fan of curiosity, right? Big fan of curiosity. If we did that in our jobs as product managers, as management, just being more curious as opposed to more directive, I think we'd get a lot more done from our creatives.
How did you come up with the idea of creating a shop like the Aviary? Like, what inspired you to do that particular thing? And what have you learned? Like, how long have you been doing this, and what have you learned from that experience?
Well, that's a whole talk in of itself, but the short answer is the Creativity Shop idea came from feeling that there was a need in this community, in particular in Seattle, to help people find their personal expression. There was also a need, and this is what I love about this organization, to bring creatives together because our creative organizations are so disparate and we don't talk to each other. And I don't care if you're in performing arts or if you're in the business sector or what, we don't connect with each other. We just don't. And the idea of having a place, a physical place that people could go to be able to have that experience was part of it. It originally was an idea we thought just having, and I say we, actually the idea came with Nicole Miller, who was the owner of Blackbird, a men's clothing store. She and I, she was a customer of mine. We were friends. We talked about creativity all the time. So when I say we, that was when I first started the store. It was with her that we did that. And the idea was like maybe we just have a table in there and say, "What's your idea?" But then we realized you had to pay for the space, and maybe selling stuff would help. And then it turned into. Then I thought, well, maybe it'd be more about objects that were really inspirational. And then it became more about the tools. So it was an evolution, even in the very process of going about it was the evolution. And now today, I do a lot of film cameras. I only sell film cameras. I'm a digital photographer, but I sell only film cameras, and I only sell like physical notebooks. I don't sell anything in the technology world. Everything is very tangible, and that was part of getting people to that experience of touching and feeling and doing something a little different. Not that I have anything against those things, but in my store it was really more about engaging people and in that touch it and feel it, and it has an emotional connection with people. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Part of it anyway. One more question?
Where's your store?
It's in Ballard on Northwest 22nd Avenue, which is like between Ballard Avenue and Northwest Market Street. You'll miss it if you don't look for it. I have a sandwich board out there, so you can see it that way. Okay, I guess one more and then we'll be done.
What was your favorite childhood toy?
My favorite childhood toy, what I wrote down when I answered that question was Hot Wheels. I'm not sure it was my favorite, but that's what I was really, really into because I love the tracks and I love how fast those cars went in relative speed. They were really cool, right? So, and you could make them fall off and crash, which is, of course, fun. All right, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.